The concept of midichlorians is one that has been long misunderstood, even in the circles of Force sensitives. Midichlorians were explored in depth during the Republic Classic era and the Clone Wars, as it was the primary method by which the Order found most prospective Jedi. The midichlorians were also the life work of Darth Plagueis, who found a way to manipulate them in order to create life. However, once the Jedi Order was rekindled after the fall of the Empire, Luke Skywalker would have a vastly different opinion about the microscopic Force organisms, and his opinion would be far different than his predecessors, which is to say that Luke didn't really trust them as a deciding factor in who or who would not be trained as a Jedi. So join us as we open a holocron and explore Luke's take on the midichlorians, and how he found students without using blood tests. Welcome acolytes to the archives, and let us begin. The midichlorians were thought to be essential, not only for discerning Force sensitivity, but also innate potential within the Force. While they are good for a generic metric of these, they're not the absolute law on how powerful someone can become. Midichlorians are essentially thousands of tiny little gates that live within organic cells. They transmit the energies of the cosmic force into the living force to generate life. This brings with it a substantial amount of midichlorians which are capable of receiving greater signals of force energy, and therefore can hear the will of the midichlorians as well as touch and manipulate the force. This has been the basic definition of what it means to be a force sensitive, which is already an extreme rarity, but for one to have more midichlorians than the required basis for force sensitivity has been typically thought to mean that that being is innately more powerful than others with lower counts. But this is not entirely true. An overabundance of midichlorians measures one's potential within the Force, and it usually means that they simply have an easier time grasping certain concepts and they gain power much faster than other students. But as proven by the case of Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was known for having a rather low midichlorian count by Jedi standards, this idea can be challenged by those willing to put forth the effort into making themselves stronger. Luke Skywalker would first learn of the existence of midichlorians a couple years after the Battle of Endor, while he was searching for more knowledge into the Jedi lore. Luke wasn't ignorant of the midichlorians' existence, but he apparently also wasn't convinced that they were so essential for discerning a Jedi's power. But that wasn't the case originally. At first, Luke had been convinced that having strong parentage was important for one to have some aptitude in the Force. All he was familiar with was the insanely strong potential of the Skywalkers, but his belief would be drastically rattled because of one individual. That person was his sister, Leia. It was 11 ABY, 2 years after the Thrawn incident, when Luke was still trying to train with Leia in the ways of the Force. Luke was hoping that she would be his first student, and that she would help him carry on the Skywalker legacy. However, he would be extremely disappointed because Leia's progress was extremely slow. In the 7 years since she had began her training, she had hardly advanced in the slightest in the Jedi path, and was still having issues even lifting small objects. Luke was frustrated because he believed that she should have had a much easier time learning the Force since Leia had the same Skywalker genes that he had. But Luke would learn that what was holding her back was her lack of training time due to her political responsibilities, as well as a mental blockage preventing her from moving forward. She was afraid of what happened to Luke, how his innocence had been completely stolen by his life as a Jedi, and how he now carried around a haunted look because of all that had happened. Despite their training sessions being a failure, Luke walked away with a very important piece of information and a lesson himself. It did not matter how innately powerful you were in the Force if your effort was not there. This meant that Luke was now going to believe in effort of his students rather than their midichlorian count. He wasn't just going to take in anyone who was Force sensitive, but those who were willing to go in all the way and learn the ways of the Jedi. But this piece of wisdom wasn't the only thing that he gained from teaching Leia. Finishing their training session, Luke decided to test her by mentally probing her. When Luke reached into her mind, pressing on and passing through random parts of her consciousness, Leia was able to resist him using the mental shielding techniques that he had taught her. But he decided to make things a little more difficult for Leia and went to the back part of her subconscious, the more primal part of her mind. All of a sudden, he was jerked out of her mind, as it felt as if a hand had pressed on his chest and physically shoved him backward. Both he and Leia were surprised at what had happened, and he did it again to the same effect. They then began to test the same thing on Luke, with Leia attempting to access the same subconscious part of Luke's mind, only to be thrown off of her feet by an invisible force. Because of this, the Grandmaster concluded that all Force sensitives must have a reflexive mental barrier that is completely instinctive, one that repels probing in that specific part of the mind. To finish the experiment, Luke would probe the mind of Wedge Antilles, only for nothing to happen. With this brand new technique, Luke would go around the galaxy following leads to those who seemed to have an extraordinary luck or strange abilities, and once he found them, Luke would talk with them to see if their minds reflexively would push him back. It was a surefire way to find someone aptitude and potential in the Force, one based off of a physical test rather than just a count of cells within their blood. This method was far more conclusive and provided actual results in the immediate. Luke also happened to find a machine from an abandoned Imperial interrogation chamber that actually measured Force sensitivity by scanning beings. Luke would use this same machine for a while, but later abstained from its use, preferring his own method of probing the mind. Much later though, Luke would make some mention of his thoughts towards midichlorians, which was that he didn't mind them at all. He believed them to be an essential part of the relationship between a Jedi and the Force, but he made it clear that he believed that any specific focus on them was time that was misplaced. When reading through the journals of Darth Plagueis, the man who notoriously had the most knowledge of the midichlorians, this is what Luke had to say. The entire focus on midichlorians is misguided. They are a natural lesson in symbiosis. When we listen to the smallest creatures, they open to us the expanse of the Force. Only a Sith would seek to dismantle a relationship that benefits both parties. The Force is a welcoming place, far larger than Plagueis' attempts to measure and minimize it. Luke Skywalker boldly declares that Plagueis had far too narrow of a focus when it came to the Force. Not just the midichlorians, but the Force overall. What he essentially says is that Plagueis limited himself by focusing too much on the midichlorians and attempting to treat the Force as if it were a finite pool of energy. To dismiss the mysticism of the Force by believing that midichlorians can measure it is to miss the entire point. The midichlorians are meant to help organics get in touch with the life energy of the Force around them. They are not the Force themselves. This is why Luke respected them, but did not trust them to be an accurate scale on which to measure Jedi by. But anyway, my friends, these were Luke's actual thoughts on the midichlorians, and why Luke refused to do blood tests of any of his students as his time of Grandmaster. Tell us, what do you think about this? If you were in Luke's position with this new knowledge, would you still measure midichlorian counts, or would you use the mental probing method? Let us know in the comments down below. And as always, my friends, may the Force be with you.